Welcome back. We are going to be covering Chapter 5. In this segment, we're going to be talking about the biological aspects of personality. All right. So let's start in the really super olden days of psychology. Sir Francis Galton wasn't technically a psychologist. He is interesting to us because he talked about intelligence. Now, this is something that I've been making sure that all of my students know whenever I teach either personality theory or tests and measurements, where we talk about it, intelligence testing a lot in that class. It's really important for me to be transparent in who Galton was, in case you think I don't know, because I do know. Galton was an English person. That's why he got knighted, right? Because Sir Francis Galton, you got to be English for that. He was a cousin of Darwin, Charles Darwin, who had just recently developed his theory of evolution. And Francis Galton thought, I wonder if more than just our bodies could have been developed through evolution, right? We call that morphological evolution, when, the number of fingers and toes we have being determined by evolution, or our eye color, or things like that. He thought, what if psychological characteristics might have been inherited? And the psychological characteristic that he was the most interested in was intelligence. So he was looking at everything through the lens of evolution, and at the same time looking at it through the lens of what's called eugenicism. This was a school of thought that was popular at the late 1800s, early 1900s, probably persisted for sure, like as a legitimate, at the time, way to look at things, probably easily into the 30s. Probably until Hitler emerged and really sort of, implemented some of the ideas. People were throwing these ideas around that there were some people who had desirable traits that should be preserved through sort of selective mating, and other traits we would like them to go away through selective mating. So some people maybe should be deprived of mating. And one of the things that, one of the characteristics that they deprived people of mating on the basis of was low IQ. I mean, that persisted in the United States, where people who had IQs below 80 could be just without their own consent, because they were deemed to not be capable of giving their own consent. They could be sterilized because their IQ was low. Now, not all causes of low IQ are due to genes. So it's not entirely, to protect the future offspring. I guess it might be an argument that, to protect them in the sense that a person with an IQ below 80 may not be competent to take care of a child or something. It's hard for me to defend the logic, so I'm just going to say I'm not exactly sure how they justified it completely in their minds. But I mean, all the way until like the 1960s, this was being done, maybe even into the 70s. And so it's not a completely antiquated thing that we're talking about here, this idea of eugenicism. A lot of people focus in on a modern version of eugenicism, which is based on race. This idea that some races have higher intelligence naturally and other races naturally have lower intelligence. And that's not really well supported either. But I just wanted to make sure that you knew that I know some of the things that are said about Galton. This is all just common knowledge in psychology, that these are attitudes that Galton held. But nevertheless, he had some really important things to say. He did talk about things that led other people who were contemporaries of his to try to undermine some of his claims, right? That's what we do in science. We hear somebody's claim and then we attempt to falsify that claim. That's how science works, is by attempting to disprove the hypothesis. So had he not offered some of these outlandish claims, people might not have studied certain areas of intelligence and other faculties without his sort of, they were offended by what he was saying also. And so it wasn't like everybody in his era thought that the things he was saying were true. But let's focus on some of the things that he said that were helpful to psychology. He said, the powers of man are finite, and if finite, they are not too large for measurement. This was an important insight to say, intellectual capabilities and things like that are measurable. That, it's not this, the factors that go into intelligence are not so varied and, imprecise that we can't establish some kind of measurement. So thanks to him sort of making that argument and really sticking behind that argument, we have modern intelligence tests that we can use. The human faculties that he identified, he is most famous for his discourse on intelligence, but he also talked about emotional temperament. One of the most notable differences between man and man lies in the emotional temperament. So just FYI, 1884, when you say man and man, it was their version of saying person and person. So just he wasn't being deliberately sexist with that phrasing. What was the point? Okay, so I assigned to you an article to read that was written by Terman, and he was talking about Galton's intelligence as a child. So what was the point of that article? Well, Terman was pointing out that intelligence is innate. Terman was one of the people who believe that intelligence was innate also. Innate means that it's biologically based, that there might be, variations among us in something like intelligence. This whole class is making the argument that people vary on different traits, intelligence being one trait, but other traits, like how outgoing you are, or how stable your moods are. Like, we vary on these things. If humans didn't vary on these qualities, there would be no purpose to study personality, because we'd all have the same personality. And I think we can all agree we don't all have the same personality. So Terman was trying to make the case that intelligence is innate. This whole chapter that we're going to be studying right now is going to make the argument that a lot of our personality characteristics are probably biologically based. So let's talk about that a little bit. Emotionality. Okay. Emotionality is made up of emotional content, so the types of emotions that one experiences. Now, there's a lot of consistency across humans for the capability to experience certain emotions. For sure happy, for sure sad, for sure scared, and for sure angry. Like, we all agree on those 4 basic emotions. And then there's mixtures of those 4s that can produce things like surprise or pride or shame. So you can get mixtures of them too. And some mixtures are seen more commonly in certain cultures, and other mixtures are seen more commonly in other cultures. But those 4 pure types of emotions are seen cross-culturally. So they probably are innate. It's really all those mixtures of different components that differentiate us from each other. Emotional style refers to the intensity of one's emotional life. So some of us experience our emotions much more intensely. We laugh louder. We, feel happiness more intensely. We feel sadness more intensely. We feel excitement or fear more intensely. Like, some people are very intense in their emotional life. Other people are much more sort of hovering around baseline all the time, where they're sort of, when they get happy, they're like, I feel pleased. When they feel sad, they're like, I am disappointed, right? Like, it's not the big, intense reactions. And so people vary on their emotional style, how intensely they experience their emotions. And then emotional stability refers to the consistency of the emotional states. So does a person have wide variations where they're intensely happy, and then in the same day they might experience intense sadness? Like, very commonly. I mean, that could happen to any of us, where we're like having a really great morning and everything is going really, we're laughing and having a good time. And then in the afternoon, we get some really bad news that makes us really sad. Of course, that can happen to anybody. I'm talking about a person who, every day has much more variation in the number of emotional states that they experience during the day. Some people experience, very consistent sort of, again, I'll just say hovering around baseline, where they're just sort of experiencing a stable amount of emotion, whereas other people are highly variable. And so this is again where we might differ. So now you could be highly variable, but the emotions may not be that intense. So you may experience lots of different emotions in one day, and that would be called, less consistent. But those emotions might not be that intense. You might experience a limited range of emotions. And so the emotional content is, not that variable from one day to the next, whereas somebody else might have lots of different emotions that they experience across, if we tracked everybody for a week, we might see that some people have lots of different emotions, and that maybe they're really intense and, they change frequently so that they're high on all three of these, or somebody who's really low on all three of these. So they don't have that many emotions. And when they do have an emotion, it's not that intense, and they don't switch that much during the day. So it's pretty consistent. Most of us are probably somewhere in the middle, honestly. But so I just really wanted you to get that there are these three factors that go into this characteristic that we call emotionality. A lot of research has gone into the emotional stability component of the emotionality trait. All right, now I wanted to kind of set up historical biological explanations, and we're going to go as far back as 450 BC to one of the earliest people who is credited for being a doctor, and that's Hippocrates. You might have heard that medical doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. That came from Hippocrates. So he argued that biological differences between people cause differences in behavior. Okay, so it sounds like he's kind of making a personality assertion here. Biological differences between people cause differences in behavior, that people consistently behave differently from one another because of these biological differences. So you'll maybe be surprised to find out what he thought the biological differences would need to be. He was talking about the degree of, or the relative levels of blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm in the person. I've picked this particular picture because in the center is an additional model, and I couldn't figure out what exactly it is. I had trouble reverse engineering what this was supposed to be, because you see spring, summer, autumn, winter personalities. But anyway, so I thought it was kind of interesting that there's another theory besides the ones I'm going to show you that are based on the idea that there's really 4 factors that contribute to your personality. Now, the air, fire, earth, and water that's in the very middle, that's kind of a really classic perception, but astrology kind of follows that, right? There's the 4 different basic personality types that astrology offers. So astrology thinks there's 4. Hippocrates thinks there's 4 basic personality types. If you have a lot of blood, if you have a lot of yellow bile, if you have a lot of black bile, if you have a lot of phlegm, then you get different personalities. A lot of blood makes you what he called a sanguine personality, and that means that you're hopeful. If you have a lot of yellow bile, he called that choleric. Choleric is how I heard it, but then this model has actually extended one more syllable. But anyway, a person who has lots of yellow bile, which I think comes from your spleen, but I'm not positive. I'm not a biological, I'm not a doctor, so don't count on it. Anyway, it comes from one of your organs. And if you have a lot of yellow bile, that means that you're quick-tempered. If you have a lot of black bile, you tend to be sad. He called that the melancholic personality. Oh, look, it says liver right under quick-tempered. Oh, I'm so blind. Yellow bile comes from your liver. And if you have a lot of yellow bile, then it makes you quick-tempered or choleric. If you have a lot of black bile, that comes out of your spleen and it makes you melancholic. It makes you sad. And then if you have a lot of phlegm, which, tends to be the mucus in your face is the most noticeable kind of phlegm, but there's phlegm in other parts of your body too. You have places where you secrete fluid, your lungs, your mouth. Women secrete fluid from This is not human sexuality. So anyway, so if you have a lot of phlegm, he says that you're what he called phlegmatic, and that means that you're apathetic. Now, if you think about it, you can imagine that there are times in your life where you might have more phlegm, for example, that it's temporary. Let's say you have a cold, right? Like you develop extra phlegm when you have a cold. And so temporarily your personality may be sort of apathetic, right? You're like, I don't know. I don't care what we're doing. I don't feel very good. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Now, I don't know if there are times when yellow bile is higher or black bile is higher or blood is higher. I don't know that that's, that I can point to things that would be very clearly temporary times when maybe your personality would be different because of those things. But him focusing in on these bodily fluids, we now know, obviously, these have nothing to do with your personality, even though we can agree that we are kind of apathetic when we have a cold. But the idea that he offered that there are 4 basic personality types is really important. That's something that we're going to see is sort of a pattern. Like I said, we see it in astrology. But again, I apologize right now if you're a big follower of astrology. It's one of those things that's not well supported, right? There's the times that we try to test astrology using scientific principles, it doesn't stand up. So far I've given you 2 models that are not really scientifically based, but the idea that there are 4 basic personality types is what I want you to hold on to. In the next segment, we'll come back and we'll talk about some more historical explanations, and this suspicious link to 4 personality types will pop up again. So we will hit that in the next video.